Welcome to the Biochar Show, where innovation meets sustainability. I'm your host, John Webster of Go Biochar. Today, we're joined by Dr. Kristin Trippe, a research microbiologist with USDA ARS, Forage, Seed, and Cereal Research Unit in Corvallis, Oregon. With more than 14 years at ARS, Kristin's current work focuses on how biochar affects soil health, from microbial dynamics to carbon sequestration and fertility. She also serves on the board of the U.S. Biochar Initiative, where she helps translate research into practical guidance, including the evolution from the 3 R's to the 4 R's of biochar. Kristin's research publications span mine-tailing remediation, juniper biochar, and sage steppe restoration, biochar to influence soil nitrogen dynamics, and boosting blueberry crops of biochar. She was a key contributor to the USDA ARS Biochar Roadmap and has led or co-led field studies that connect microbial signals to agronomic outcomes. Perhaps her role as the program manager of the Pacific Northwest Biochar Atlas is the most impactful. The Biochar Atlas is a decision support platform that helps producers and consultants select appropriate biochars based on soils, cropping goals, carbon content, and nutrient needs in conducting economic cost-benefit analysis. Kristin, it's great to finally record one of our conversations after 3 years of working together at USBI.
It's so nice to see you, John. You've been such a key player in connecting biochar producers with biochar end users. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate your commitment and your ongoing work in this really evolving dynamic space.
Thank you for that. But we're here today to talk about you. So I want to jump on into kind of the topic at hand. We want to follow your path into soil science and the Biochar Atlas and then the RNS Code 336, discuss real world results, your education and outreach processes, and kind of what's next for the biochar tools. So let's start at the beginning and let the listeners in on your path into soil science.
So I was not one of these people who decided when I was a child or a teenager or even a young adult that I wanted to be a scientist. My evolution into science was a long, circuitous path. When I moved to Oregon to take a gap year before I started university, I fell in love with forests and the mushrooms that you find in forests and decided that I really wanted to understand how fungi behave in soil. And so instead of pursuing a liberal arts degree, I kind of switched it up and started studying mycology and botany and forest ecology.
On that journey after your studies, what led you to join the USDA ARS? And also, we want to explain our acronyms. And for those that may not know, please share what ARS means.
Yeah, so I work at the USDA Agricultural Research Service. We are located 95 locations across America. So anywhere that you find agriculture, you're likely to find a USDA ARS station. And our mission is to solve critically important agricultural problems, whether those are national or global problems. And so some people say that we are the best kept secret in the USDA because what we do is we make these discoveries, these advances in practices, and then we hand them back to our stakeholders and they take a hold of them and implement them. So as far as I'm concerned, I have the best gig in science because I get to work with researchers, university students, farmers, and all kinds of stakeholders from biochar producers to users to folks trying to implement these practices. And it's awesome.
I agree. I think you do have one of the best jobs out there.
I think that what led me to join ARS was that I always wanted to be able to translate my science to solve real world problems. And so I started off, my PhD was in using fungi to remediate polluted soils. And so I really saw myself working at the EPA, but they're a really regulatory agency. And then when I learned about ARS and what they do, I was very drawn to join this agency and to dedicate my career to it.
So it caught your heart and your mind. That's wonderful. So I guess the question is, when and how did you learn about biochar and become interested in biochar research?
Yeah, so I was hired by the USDA as a microbial biochemist, which is really what my training is in. I worked here for about a year and a half. And then a lot of the folks that were involved in my local unit here in Corvallis, they retired. And I didn't want their programs to just sit while we went through the process of hiring new people. And so there were pieces of different programs that I felt spoke to my expertise. And one of them was a mine remediation project located in Southern Oregon using biochar. And then there was a farmer up in Washington who was producing the biochar that we were using on the mine. And so I started learning about biochar, and it really kind of meshed well with my background in ecology, remediation, and microbes. And so, yeah, I just kind of fell in love with it pretty quickly, like what happens with most biochar.
Yeah, it's a deep rabbit hole. But was there a particular field result or data set that kind of made it click a little bit beyond just that initial kind of spark?
Yeah, for sure. So this is kind of my favorite story. There was this farmer, David Gady, and he has a farm up in Washington, and he struggles with pH on his soils like most farmers in Eastern Washington. And David had a gasification unit on his farm that he could produce biochar with, but he had never really used it as a lime substitute. And so we approached David and said, we thought this would be a really good amendment for his soils to address his pH issues. And we planted a field trial with the intent of bringing up the one pH unit. So we added biochar at 8 tons an acre, and then we added lime to bring it up the same pH amount. And then we had these control plots. And the following spring, you could just drive up and you could see visibly which plots had biochar in them because they were so different in terms of the amount of growth, the amount of green that was on the field. And the lime plots also were increased over, the control plots, but it was just visibly so shocking that I actually came back to my boss and I was like, hey, we fixed this problem. Like, we solved this yield gap up in Washington, and it was really fun.
When you can turn a system around and you just see that lush, vibrant color, it feels good. It's beautiful to look at, and it's super encouraging. Let's move towards some of the tools. I want to talk about the Biochar Atlas. Your team supports the biochar industry, and this is very critical, and it's one of the more impactful tools that you developed with the Biochar Atlas. And I believe that launched around 2017 or 2018. Can you tell us what gaps the Atlas set out to fill inside the farmer decision-making around biochar?
No one in my lab at the time had a real good grounding in biochar. And so we were kind of doing these weekly meetings where we were discussing, new and emerging biochar research. And it kept coming back almost every study that we would read that the results were dependent on the feedstock and the temperature of the biochar. And it kind of became a joke in our lab meetings that, yep, feedstock, yep, temperature. We just kept talking about how these one soil, one crop, one biochar studies were just not very useful in providing guidance to farmers on how to use biochar. And so as part of a grant that we received from USGS, they asked us to build a decision support tool. And so it was kind of a no-brainer at the time. Well, what kind of tool is needed? A tool is needed that farmers can find a biochar that meets their needs. And so that's what we set out to create. And it's just expanded from there.
Okay, so how did the soils, crops, and specific goals, your cropping objectives, how do they interact with the decision support tool?
So we wanted to give farmers the opportunity to do a number of things. First, to identify what problem they were trying to solve. I can't tell you how many phone calls or emails I get that say, should I apply biochar and how much should I apply? And my response to them is always, well, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Is the problem you're trying to solve a carbon deficiency? Is it a pH deficiency? Is it a nutrient deficiency? Because all of those play into that decision that you'll make as to what biochar and how much of that biochar to use. And so the first thing we needed to do was to provide farmers with a way to get their soil data. So you can either input your data through a form, or you can select it off of a map in the way that the current Atlas is set up. And then you can go through the Atlas will then allow you to choose a crop. Right now we have about 40 Pacific Northwest crops that are in the Atlas. You can say that you're growing beans and it'll say, well, here's the nutrient requirements, here's the pH requirements you need, here are the current, conditions in your soil. So, would you like to solve a specific problem? And then from that, you can prioritize 3 different goals, and it'll find a biochar that, best matches that goal set.
Thank you for explaining. That's fantastic. I want to take a moment and point out that it's pnwbiochar.org, biochar.org. So head there now. So let's talk about how the integration of the Biochar Atlas and other USDA tools like the Web Soil Survey, how do they work together towards the soil health goals and supporting farmers? Are there other integrations that exist or are on the way?
Yeah. So within Web Soil Survey, which if you haven't gotten to Web Soil Survey, you're just missing out. Web Soil Survey is an incredible national resource that I think is really underutilized. You can choose a soil, an area of interest, and then it'll tell you all about your soils. And one of the things it will now tell you about your soils as to whether or not they're suitable for biochar use. And that's based off of inherent properties of the soil. So that's a really important tool. Is my site suitable? Does it have the right slope? Does it have the right water conditions to apply biochar? Will it respond to biochar application? And then the second tool is, of course, the Atlas. And I can talk about the national expansion of the Atlas soon. The third tool is that if you want to sort of mix and match amendments, say you want to add part compost, part lime, part dolomite, part biochar, we've developed a calculator where you can figure out whether or not those amendments are suitable and how much of each of those amendments you should apply in order to not kind of mess things up.
Yeah, that prescriptive practice, so we're building recipes to address specific concerns, is really fantastic. It's something that a lot of the industry doesn't know about. In particular, most farmers don't even know about it. And so I do know that you've been working with groups like American Farmland Trust and others and USBI and everybody you can talk to, frankly, in order to get that news out. Real quick, how far back does the soil information go on the Web Soil Survey? How many? It's like 40 years, 75 years, 100 years?
The information that's available on Web Soil Survey, and of course, I don't work for NRCS, and so you probably have better information from them about this, but Web Soil Survey really tells you about your inherent soil properties. So it doesn't necessarily tell you about properties over time, but what it will do is it will tell you specifically about a mapping unit. So a mapping unit will be like, I'm on Willamette soil, and then it will tell you all the characteristics of that Willamette soil. Or if you're on a Dayton soil, it will tell you that. And it will tell you about the inherent properties of that soil. What is the soil texture? What is the soil depth? Is it a gravelly soil? It'll tell you a lot about it. But what it doesn't capture management information. And so if you're an organic farmer and you have put, years and years worth of compost on your soil test that you get back probably doesn't reflect the organic matter that's in your native soil profile. So while it will tell you about the soil series, it doesn't tell you about your soil necessarily.
Yeah. Real quick, I've been curious. What's your favorite soil test?
Gosh, organic matter, 100%.
You mentioned talking about the Biochar Atlas and expansion plans. When do you think you're going to get beyond the Pacific Northwest region?
Yeah, well, so in 2022, we were granted funding from the NRCS to expand the Biochar Atlas to the entire United States. And so we are there. The National Biochar Atlas was released about 2 months ago. It's available on the Pacific Northwest Biochar Atlas website. I will say that, and a lot of that work was done by Rachel Bashiri. Rachel was a fellow in my lab, and she took kind of the framework that Claire Phillips and I put together and expanded it. She didn't just expand the geographical relevance, but she also expanded some of the analyses that we've done, and she added in commercial biochars, which is a huge leap forward because the biochars that were originally listed in the Biochar Atlas were all biochars that we produced in the lab. And so it wasn't like you could do this and then necessarily buy a local biochar. All the biochars that are listed in the National Atlas are available commercially right now, which is super cool. So what we did was we took the top 10 crops in every state, and then we listed all of the nutritional and fertility requirements required for those crops. And we also added functionality so that instead of just looking for a random biochar that meets your needs, you can also type in your zip code so that that biochar can be found within a reasonable region.
That's cool. How will biochar producers get listed on that? Do you have some kind of submission process?
Yeah, you can email me at kristin.trippe@usda.gov, and we will happily add your information.
Yeah. I remember trying to get the kind of that biochar calculator on the USBI website. And so I really want to take a moment and thank Josiah Hunt from Pacific Biochar because he's the one who developed the original baseline spreadsheet for the calculator. So Josiah has long been a pioneer in the biochar space. And so he was a strong contributor to this, for which we are all grateful. Let's get into NRCS and the code 336 and on the ground use. So we're going from the decision support tool to practice. And now when we connect the NRCS funding and the tool set that the landowners are using, there's been a little bit of confusion. There was so much optimism. It was starting to drive a lot of interest and investments into agriculture and into the biochar space. And then recently there's been a little confusion. So kind of first thing first is the NRCS Conservation Practice Standard 336 Soil Carbon Amendment. What is its current status and how is it being applied?
Yeah, so the status is that it's an active conservation practice, along with, hundreds of other conservation practices, from no-till to cover cropping to, terracing, nutrient management, soil health testing. The conservation practice portfolio is really diverse. Nothing's really changed about how 336 is implemented. But that's a decision that's made at the state and the county level. So because it's so diverse, I would definitely recommend people talk to their local NRCS conservation agent, which can be found whatever county you're in the United States. So please reach out to the NRCS and talk to them about what the process is to access some of these really important conservation programs.
Okay. Yeah. And thank you for clarifying that. I do know that for a lot of folks, the inquiries, producers, brokers, the suppliers, that a lot of the inquiries from farmers kind of halted, but we were starting to see private industry, private landowners all picking up the interest. So knowing that the NRCS program is back is fantastic. 336 is really an important driver.
Yeah, and for your listeners who don't know, 336 provides cost share for the application of carbon-based amendments to soil, and that can include biochar for sure. It can also include other carbon-based amendments like compost, even,
mulch
and other mulch,
yeah.
other carbon-based amendments. So this is so key to farmers wanting to apply biochar to bring down the cost of testing, application, and actually purchasing the product itself.
Thanks for clarifying that. I guess I want to know, what involvement did you have with developing the standard? Were you an advisor? Did you participate in writing it up? Like, what's...
No, I mean,
nothing?
certainly no, nothing. I mean, other than, providing, casual feedback to some of the folks who originally authored it. I wasn't involved at all. But what I have been involved in is really heavily in developing tools to implement that practice, because conservation agents across the country have a huge repertoire of practices that they need to be knowledgeable about. Like I just mentioned a few a minute ago, biochar is new. Compost is relatively new to the NRCS. And so providing, the folks who are actually implementing it on the ground with tools to understand whether or not this is a smart decision or how it can be a smarter decision is really important. So we've been trying to develop not just these tools, but also fact sheets, guidelines, and just general knowledge around biochar.
What might you be expecting to come out in terms of BMPs, the best management practices? I mean, the fact sheets are great guidelines, but it's not really a BMP.
Yeah. I mean, I think the problem is that, a BMP in where I live in grass seed cropping systems is not the same BMP that you're going to find in corn and soy. And it's not the same BMP that you're going to find in orchards. And so I think that we need to develop practical guidance by cropping system so that we can help people figure out when, where, and how to apply biochar. So, we're working with USBI to develop a train the trainer session so that we can work both with conservation agents, land grant, university extension, to try to develop local cropping system relevant guidance for applying biochar across America.
So kind of another common comment made by many in the industry is that the prescriptive biochar amounts that come through this 336 program, they tend to be low compared to real world experience, and that the allocation of funds, they end up resulting in a low incremental input amount over the 1 to 4 years that the farmers awarded it. And we're often seeing that this leaves farmers with the impression that biochar is ineffective. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I think there's two thoughts. I think that NRCS funding is targeted, and it's difficult to make huge investments on one farm. And so when they do provide cost share, it's definitely easier to spread it out across a lot of farms, which means, of course, lower rates of application. But that doesn't mean those rates are not beneficial, depending on what your research conservation goal or your resource concerns are. So if you're just trying to apply carbon to an area, which is, of course, what 336 is meant to address, is carbon deficiencies. And so if you're doing that and you're applying 1 ton an acre, you're still making that incremental change. And so, are you going to see a yield increase? Maybe, maybe not. But I think that's the beautiful thing about Conservation Practice Standard 336 is that it takes the value proposition of biochar from we have to have a distinct yield increase to offset the cost of biochar to more of a ecological services perspective. So instead of a yield proposition, it's now an ecosystem services proposition, much like no-till, much like cover cropping. So I kind of love that. And I will just wrap this back around to the story I told at the beginning about this farmer in Washington who had this farm. We ended up increasing his yield almost 300%, right? It was, and I just 300, we tripled his yield in wheat on these
That's
plots.
massive. That's
It's
massive.
crazy. And David came over to the plots and he looked at it. He's like, not going to work. And I was stunned. I was like, well, what do you mean it's not going to work? And he very, kindly took me through the economics of wheat production at, $6, $7 a bushel. And the cost of biochar at the time was just so astronomical. He was never going to offset his cost, even at tripling his yield. But if he took into account cost share provided by the NRCS, it's a no-brainer. He could have yield increase and he wouldn't have this upfront investments into his soils that, are not just an investment for today, but an investment across generations. I think reframing the use of biochar as a yield booster to the use of biochar for a soil health, for soil resilience booster is a really important frame shift that 336 allows us to contextualize.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing that. That's absolutely accurate. And the farmers can always purchase more. And then I guess David, did he look at the longer term? Did he consider the fact that, this 300% year after year, does that justify, was that more likely to justify the investment?
Well, so on the Biochar Atlas website, we do have a cost estimator that'll look at the cost over 5 years, right? Because one of the problems with the biochar studies that are in the literature is that very few of them extend beyond 5 years. And so we really have this dramatic need for long-term research to understand not just what happens right after you add biochar, but what happens 10, 20, 30 years down the road. But getting those studies funded is incredibly difficult because the funding structure does not work on 30-year cycles, right? So, it's just an artifact of the way that that funding is granted. So, no, I don't think that David could do that. But even looking over 5 years, it wasn't even over 5 years that 300% increase would not have provided him the offset he would need to for an ROI.
Yeah. Well, I think we also need to take into account the criteria of that situation because I know 5, 6 years ago when I first started in the industry, a big yard of biochar often was costing anywhere from $600 to $700 a yard. And nowadays you're dramatically lower. You can buy tonnage in that range and even lower now. So
yeah, I think
that
the
makes
economics
the calculator fit so much more.
Yeah, and that's why we have this cost benefit analysis calculator on the website so people can estimate. If I'm going to have a 3% increase in yield, you can add that in. If you're going to be able to decrease your lime cost because all of a sudden you're adding in a material that has 18% calcium carbonate equivalents, you can calculate that. So it's a really dynamic tool, and I encourage folks to go try it out because I think it's fun to play around with.
It is fun and it's getting in line or cheaper than a lot of the chemical fertilizers. So, and it's entirely complementary. Again, let's get prescriptive about all the elements that we're adding into our soils, find out what's going to meet those objectives and long-term soil health, the biologicals, the water holding capacity. That's kind of a big deal. So, all right, let's move on to the next subject. I want to talk about kind of your role as a biochar educator. You have the 3 R's of biochar, which has now turned into the 4 R's framework. So give us a playbook and how it applies to what you've been doing, your efforts with USBI and with ARS around the 4 R's.
Yeah, well, the 4 R's are, this is how nutrient management has been talked about for decades, right? So putting nutrients in the right place, from the right source, at the right rate, at the right time. And in nutrient management, that timing part of it is usually tied to, when crops need the nutrients. So of course, you're not going to apply nitrogen at harvest. You're going to wait until the crop has a need for nitrogen, and that's when you're going to apply your fertilizer mix. Biochar is a little bit different. So we still have, the right source, making sure that the biochar you're choosing has a physicochemical, profile that fits your goals for your cropping system. Make sure that you're applying it at a rate that will meet those goals in the right place. So making sure that the soil is, it's meeting the needs of the soil and the crop. And then also timing is important though too. And that's something that, I kind of didn't originally think about. I was originally like, well, it doesn't really matter when you put it down. And so we only included the 3 R's to begin with. But, recent conversations have really changed my thinking about that, because the best time to put it down is probably when you're already doing a tillage practice.
Mhm.
Or when you're working the soil in some way. And so, you hear a lot about how disturbance for soils is bad, and that's absolutely true. But instead of never doing disturbance, you're just optimizing disturbance. And so that very much fits in with apply biochar when you're trying to manage weeds, when you're trying to shape your soil profile for planting, but don't do it again, right?
Yeah.
So try to
Maximize it.
piggyback. Yeah.
Optimize.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I like about the Biochar Atlas, and this ties into 336 and just general soil health principles for cropping systems, is the fact that I can go on there, I can look at the different types of carbon content based on feedstocks. So I can do that. Also, when I'm working with folks, I often want to explain that there's no such thing as the perfect biochar, only the perfect biochar for the application. Because again, you're talking about the physical and chemical properties on what we're going to apply to the soils in order to meet the objectives. And I am of the personal opinion that in kind of the near term, we are going to see where biochars are more prescriptive. You might have more of a need for a silica content mixed with a certain amount of water holding capacity. So you might be told, okay, you need 80% of woody biomass biochar, a little bit of animal manure biochar, 5%, and then 15% rice hull because you're shy on silica. So I think that's right around the corner, is my personal opinion.
It's not any different from how they do fertilizers, right? I mean, we're just taking this concept of biochar and trying to, figure out how we can best put it into a system. And usually that best is not this one thing that came out of this one pyrolysis unit with this one feedstock. So I totally agree that blending it either with other biochars or with other things is probably the best way to go.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've used with the 3 R's, now 4 R's, is when you talk about place, a little bit more of the focus on the placement, because there's often, just like you talked about with the tillage, people think if they just apply it to the top of the soil, that's a misnomer, right? You need to get it in where it makes the most sense, which is that root zone. That's where it's going to be the most benefit. And then I also point out that when you're working with programs like the NRCS and that Code 336 and general biochar practices for your cropland, it does often perform optimally when you include a nutrient component as well, because that raw biochar can be a little bit hungry, depending on the health of your soil. So we just want to be aware of that. So in terms of the Atlas enhancements that are coming up, what might we see? Do you have any specific additional features, any more features that we haven't covered? And then also, do you have any stories from both maybe the farmer perspective and maybe the biochar perspective that relates back to the Atlas?
Yeah. So first, to answer your first question, I just mentioned we released the National Biochar Atlas, and I also mentioned that it's a little clunky because what we have a bunch of soil scientists who are trying to do web design, which does not. I know it's crazy, but it doesn't always work out great. And I don't want to disparage Rachel; she did a fantastic job putting this together. But what we're hoping is that we can make it more user friendly, a little bit prettier, but also add some functionality. So some of the functions that I think we'll be able to add is this idea of blending. So if you want to input one biochar with a compost, if you want to select two biochars at different rates, we'll be able to then, make those predictions on how that will react with your soil for your crop growth. So that's really exciting. At first, we were doing in-house analyses of biochar so that we could have our own consistent results to add in physical chemical properties of these different commercial biochars. Right now, if people have their own testing that they've done through commercial labs, we're happy to take those results and add those in. So the wait time to get on the Atlas will be a lot shorter. And then, just continuing to add new tools, new guides. Debbie Aller, who's out of New York, and I are putting together a document on how to do a field trial, which I think is really key because it's
Really
not as
is.
simple. It's not as simple
It's
as
not.
just putting something in the ground and comparing it. There's a lot of thought that needs to go into putting together a field trial. So we're providing that guidance. We're just really excited for this to be a continuing evolution of things. Gosh, and then a story about the Atlas. I think one of the things I love about the Atlas right now are the case studies that Claire Phillips and Kylie Meyer mostly put together. I think they span a really broad range of systems, including mining, including rangeland systems, which was, and I love that we have, success stories, and we also have not so success stories. Because it's really important to learn from your mistakes. And oftentimes, you don't see that in scientific publications. What did I do wrong? How could I have done this better? What other choices would I have made? And so keeping that, library of case studies growing and expanding and evolving over the life of the Atlas, I think is going to be cool too. So if you put biochar in the ground and you want to tell me about it, I would love to write a case story and put that on the web so that other people can learn about from, your experience.
Yeah, especially if you're collecting that data, right? Because the data points and statistical analysis, they matter.
I mean, farmers learn from me, but farmers mostly learn from their peers.
Right.
And so providing that peer-to-peer learning platform, I think, is really key to implementing these practices.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, as an industry, we owe a big debt of thanks to USDA for funding this program. You and your team at ARS, the development of this has been absolutely critical, and it's made a real and measurable change to the total industry, domestic. And, I know that there are folks that are doing things like using the calculator from other countries. They look up similar soils on the Web Soil Survey, see what the prescriptive identifiers are there, similar to their lands where they are. They use your calculator. So it's not limited to only domestic US, while that's the primary focus. It's kind of a little the tool cheat code in order to build that soil carbon quickly and efficiently. But I am off topic. So remember, we were talking about outreach and education, and I know that STEM education is important to you. And so how do you see this impacting the future of soil health and biochar?
If I can help people get interested in biochar or get interested in soil, that means so much to me. I will say that I have a lot of students come through my lab. We work very closely with Oregon State University, and I love having high school and undergraduate students in my lab to learn about soil and how we measure its different properties, and microbes and how we measure their different properties. I think the beautiful thing about soil and microbes is that if you're a plant biologist and a botanist, you might discover a plant during your career. If you're a zoologist, chances are pretty low you're going to discover a new mammal. But I'll tell you what, I can walk out in my backyard and I can pick up a teaspoon of soil and I might find a microbe that can solve a really important problem. And that possibility of discovery is what makes me come to work every single day, is because, the soil is a living, dynamic ocean underneath our feet. And just being able to look at it through a different lens every day is just so cool. So come be a soil scientist. We're really nerdy, and we really love what we do, and it's a ton of fun.
I'm going to nerd out with you for a second, because originally we spent our days looking up at the stars, right, in our human development. The next thing you know, we have some telescopes and we can see further. We can see the celestial bodies. And then somebody looked a little bit inward, and then all of a sudden we have microscopes. And we discover a whole new world. And that world is still dramatically underexplored and underutilized, under-researched. But there are so many opportunities there. And just that whole transition from above to under our feet, go, and plant your gardens, plant your fields, go and be a microbe rancher.
Also, like, go for a ride on the river. And as you're running through the river, look at the bank and just appreciate for a minute the soil profile that goes down, thousands and thousands of years, and how those layers have evolved and changed and developed is just it's one of my favorite things to do.
Yeah, and when I do something like that, I'm usually thinking about the fire cycle and the fact that, biochar is mimicking nature's processes. Nature did the research and development for us. It may not have blinking lights, but it had fire. It was depositing that soil carbon enhanced with the plant growth and the root establishment, and that's what kind of helps those banks stay stable.
Yeah, and biochar is really traditional ecological knowledge that was used by indigenous cultures around the world, not just in the Amazon, but in Australia, in Europe, in Iowa. We are just harnessing that knowledge and trying to really understand it so that we can use these prescriptive approaches. But it's really not that different from what was happening thousands of years ago.
And what's fun about STEM is educating children about that. High school students. I've done presentations at high schools. I've done different events when I was working at USBI and also with Biochar on site. One of my favorite things to do is at these shows, at these events, I'll put out some biochar chunks and some paper and have the kids draw on it. And then so I get them in and I start talking about it. And I say, hey, you know what to do when you grow up? That's going to be really fun. Be a soil scientist. And then also be a soil scientist that works with biochar, because then you get to play in the dirt and play with fire. And how does it get any more fun than that?
Yeah. And you can also paint with clay.
Yeah.
Just like having different soil-based media on your table and then creating paintings from that is also really fun.
Yeah.
And really nerdy.
I know. I love it all. So let's talk about some of your research highlights and crop responsive behaviors. So among your published studies, such as mine tailing remediations, the juniper biochar in rangeland, your work on blueberries. I know that I've given you a number of referrals for people that work with blueberry cropping systems. So what are the findings that surprised you most?
I would say the findings that surprised me most were the mine site. There's this mine in Southern Oregon. It's a super fun site. It's a tiny piece of land, 84 acres, but it affects the entire ecosystem of Southern Oregon because it adds so much acidity into the nearby waters. Mm. This land has been barren since the 1980s. Not a tree has grown on it. And so we had a collaboration with the US EPA and Mark Johnson, and we went in and amended with biochar, lime, and biosolids, all locally derived products. And we amended the soils and we got plants to grow. And those plants are still growing, 6-7 years later. This is soil that had a pH less than 2. Wow. Right? And 0 organic carbon. And we've been able to recreate that ecosystem in such a way that the EPA is actually now implementing our practices across that entire site, which of course has huge implications for the people who live in Southern Oregon and the wildlife in Southern Oregon. So I think that was the most exciting to me, not necessarily because we were able to change something that had this long history of soil degradation, but because if we can solve this problem on soils that have a pH between 1 and 2, have 0 organic carbon, have very nutrient poor conditions, have really high hydraulic conductivity, so water just moves them, really quickly and doesn't stay around. If we can solve all those problems to get that to grow, imagine what we can do on soils that aren't that critically in decline. And so that really motivates me to put it into these different cropping systems that you talked about.
I occasionally talk to folks that are in the oil and gas remediation practices. More and more, they're being allowed a certain small percentage of aggregate of their choice. And biochar is starting to come forward more frequently. There was a paper that just came out a couple of weeks ago. So that was really interesting. But your remediation paper is one that I always send over. So really looking forward to great things coming out of there. I know it's still a developing segment, but lots of promise. What crops have you found to be the most responsive to biochar?
I think that it's a crop issue. I think it's a soil issue, right? Because if you have a soil that's deficient in water, in nutrients, fertility, then your crops aren't going to thrive. And so the best soils that we've worked with are sandy soils and, of course, blueberries. especially in the South, are grown in very sandy soils, potatoes. My wheat story that I told, where we were able to raise the pH by providing a local amendment that was available to ameliorate that pH and increasing the yield of wheat by 300%. It's just been a lot of fun to work in these different crops and not asking necessarily like, how can we make this crop grow better, but how can we manage the soil to help support the crop? And I think that is really what needs to be the focus. So it's really cool.
Healthy soils grow healthy crops. So
yeah, and healthy people too. Yeah.
And healthy people. Win, win, win. What's not to love about that? So looking ahead, what are the most pressing research needs to support biochar adoption that we'll see maybe coming out of ARS and USBI?
Well, I'm hoping that we can start to implement long-term studies so that we can finally understand what happens to biochar in the long run. It's funny because, of course, the terra preta soils, the soils in Iowa, these soils have been, amended with biochar again for millennia. And so we know that it lasts a long time. We know it's still there. We know it makes the soil more fertile. But in order to model that and predict what happens, we really need more granular data or less granular data. So trying to really understand what's happening at the molecular level, what's happening in the interactions between the soil and plants is really important over the long term. So hopefully we can do some of those studies. I think we really need some basic information too. What's the best way to work with this material? What's the best way to apply this material? What's the best timing for that? Does one application work, or are you better off doing an application every time that you're planning on tilling? So trying to understand some of these basic questions that have been left out of these sort of one biochar, one crop, one soil studies is I think really key moving forward.
Yeah, the practical application guidance is really fantastic. And one time I gave an hour-long talk, and these farmers at this soil health conference, they were very interested, but I could tell I was losing them from time to time. I had a real brief segment that showed equipment applying the biochar, and that's when they perked up. And then afterwards, all they wanted to do is I had a couple of 5-minute clips of in-field application, and I showed it to them on my laptop, and they were glued. They were literally glued to it. That's all they wanted to see. But there is an absolute dearth of that. We are lacking that kind of content on YouTube and Vimeo. There's a few things and some of the specialty tools that we see coming out, especially for vineyard application, but in-field application strategies, understanding what types of biochar can go through what types of machines. They're starting to buy into biochar. Now they're just confused about how to apply it. So I totally agree with that.
Well, and I think, again, that, involving the land grant extension network, the certified crop advisor network, so that people who work with farmers every day can understand how this works, so that we can kind of take it out of, the ivory tower and really deliver it to the stakeholders who need
it. One of the things I think I worry about, and that this kind of shared across the industry, is that, those agents, NRCS folks, the Extension University participants, they have these manuals, like that conservation practice standards list book's 1,200 pages. So it's kind of hard. And then and as you know, with over 30 some odd thousand technical and peer reviewed papers on biochar, it is and more coming and coming. It's just
light
an
reading,
inundation.
John,
And it's light reading. It's always such light reading. So brush up on your chemistry. So related chemistry, what advice would you share for soil scientists, planners, crop advisors that are looking to integrate biochar into their soil health strategies?
I would say, look over the resources that are available. It's not, like you pointed out, it's not easy going to the literature and finding a study that can inform what you want to do. But the work that AFT has done, American Farmland Trust, US Biochar Initiative, USDA, New York Soil Health, all of these folks have worked really closely together to try to put together implementation guidance. And so look there first, because those resources do exist. And I think they're really good resources.
Yeah, and I think I'd also tell them to look to networks like LinkedIn and go follow those soil scientists that actually do publish things on there. See how you can get involved with them, ask them questions. So I know we're getting close to wrapping up. What's next in your work with ARS? Are there any research initiatives that you're excited about right now?
I'm really excited to get the National Atlas in a way that's more usable and more intuitive out there. I'm really excited to continue to work with folks to think about how to make it better. So if folks go to the website and they have some ideas about how to make it more user-friendly, please, again, reach out to me personally. I love talking to people and getting ideas about how to make this more useful, more accurate, just more relevant.
Yeah. It's an organic living document. It's an
Just like
organic
soils,
living
right?
tool. Yeah, it always progressing. And that's really valuable. It shows that you're not stuck in a specific practice or perception. Always open to change. Let's fix it. So again, that's wonderful. Kristin, thank you so much for joining our program today. Your team and the USDA play a critical role in the future of the industry and in domestic soil health. Thank you for your work and for being one of the most influential members of the larger biochar industry. On a personal note, I believe that you are one of the giants in the space. People don't realize the extent of the support that you've provided the industry through your work at ARS and with USBI. We wouldn't be where we are today without your input. So thank you on that level.
Thank you. That's really kind.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a fantastic conversation. I know we have some future soil scientists out there listening and want to pick your brain about getting involved with biochar and resilient soil health practices.
Turf is one of the biggest crops grown in the United States. People grow it in their yard, people grow it on golf courses, in parks, and of course on baseball fields. And so I personally use turf or biochar in our turf in our yard, and it makes a big difference in holding water and holding nutrients, in capturing runoff from pollution that, of course, I contribute. So I would love to see biochar used more often in turf. I think it has real value.
So I guess one question in the future will be, what tool can we expect for turf managers inside the Biochar Atlas? I mean, that's
a great question.
Turf being the largest crop, I think maybe that's going to need some thought.
Yeah,
So
I'll work on it.
All right. Well, so thank you for sharing. For anybody that wants to connect and follow your work, where's the best place for them to find you?
I'm available at kristin.trippe@usda.gov. I'm best reached by email, or you can reach out directly through the Atlas site, which again, pnwbiochar.org. LinkedIn is fine too. I'm available there.
Yeah.
Reach out to me however you can. My best moments of my day are when I get to interact with my stakeholders. And so I love taking phone calls and emails and working with people to solve problems.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. So we want to encourage all you farmers, soil scientists, home gardeners to explore the Biochar Atlas. For those of you it's applicable to, research the NRCS 336 resources, then share your results and questions in the comments below on this podcast episode. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. The best way to support the Biochar Show is by subscribing on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. Be a true biochar supporter and leave a 5-star review. It really helps others discover the show. While you're at it and you're still online, go and buy some biochar off of your favorite retailer site, because we do have vendors that are selling bags of biochar and some really amazing potting media. So big thanks to Dr. Kristin Trippe of USBI and ARS, and to the global biochar community for keeping the science practical. We will see you on the next episode of the Biochar Show.